all here, ready now to get started. I'm Gloria, and this is Jim. Jim is primarily responsible for the photos. Together we've worked on the history. He doesn't like to talk to you unless he thinks I've messed up, so therefore then he'll interrupt. This is a very informal presentation to give you information. And as such, if you have any questions or something that was said that you don't understand, stop us and talk. We'll talk about it right then. To give you a little information, Jim was born in the Kirkland Hospital here, and his grandfather lived in an old log cabin on the Redmond Kirkland Road.
On Rose Hill.
On Rose Hill. Unfortunately, I was born in Seattle and moved out at the end of World War II to where Alderwood Mall is. And then that became too crowded, so with all those people, so we moved to Bothell. And then when we got married, we started life in Bothell, then moved to Woodinville. And then recently we moved to Trilogy, but we're still active with Woodinville history.
Excuse me, Gloria. Would you tell them why we're doing these photos? What the final outcome is going to be?
The final outcome is we wish to do a book again because we put out the first one on the history of Woodinville, and since then the archives in the state were now available. When the state went through financial problems, they locked up the archives in the basement and no one, regardless of their credentials, had access. Now you can get to them. There are other places you can go now which you could not get before, including the photos for the Times and the PI, which you could not do when we did the first book. So we set out to write another book. Well, we kept accumulating all this information and accumulating all this information. And we're still working on volume 1 because we've now discovered there are going to be 3 volumes to this set because there's so much information. So we decided instead of everybody having to wait until the end, as we get information, we will put it into the PowerPoint presentation. We started out by doing transcripts of the old pioneers and their descendants and getting their photos at the end. And then we discovered, okay, we'll start with that. Don't assume that what anybody has told you is accurate. So then we had to go to all the other public sources, the legal sources, to verify what you're getting is correct. And in some cases, we really don't know, and we tell you that we can't verify it, but this is what the stories that come down have said. Okay. The first people here were the Sinop Indians, and they were part of the Snoqualmie Indian tribe. They inhabited the land between Lake Sammamish and Lake Washington. They did not have a settlement in Woodinville. They just traversed it back and forth all the time and could do their hunting. The Native Americans used the word squaw to describe the swampy lowland of the valley. So the early white settlers in turn named the waterway Squaw Slough, which was later renamed Sammamish River. This meandering waterway was the main transportation of the early settlers. In fact, it was the only transportation besides your 2 feet.
That's the sign, yeah.
This is a family, native family, picking hops. We grew hops in the valley, in Woodinville. They also grew them in Issaquah. They also grew them in the Kent Valley. They were easy to grow. They were easy to harvest if you didn't mind getting stucky stick. And the reason we were growing hops are hops are used in making beer. In Europe, they had a virus come through and wipe out all the hops in all of Europe. Well, eventually, the Germans and the English decided they could not live without their beer and were willing to pay any cost in order to get it. So we picked the hops We've shipped them to Seattle. We put them on a boat. The boat goes down the west coast, all the way around South America because the Panama Canal isn't there yet, then across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. This went on until 2 years in a row we had massive aphid infestation, and they didn't have DDT back then, so they gave up growing hops. The first white settlers in the area were the Woodins. The area was restricted until September of 1871 when the railroads released acreage that could then be used for homesteading. So they were the first ones that came up the river, and they homesteaded 160 acres. Back then, you had a choice. First of all, 160 acres is the maximum anybody could have. Whether you were one individual or a married couple, it was 160 acres. And you could either buy it outright, which is what the Woodins did. They paid $200 for their 160 acres. Or you could say, I will prove this up and get so much land cleared and my house built, etc., for $10 for 160. Or if you didn't have $10, you could get your 80 acres for $5 and go back, and maybe if no one's filed for the other 80, you could get it then for another $5. This is an area, 1936 aerial view of the Sammamish Valley. On the right, you have your pointer? Okay. That is San Michelle Winery. On the left, way down there, that is 124th, and this is going up the hill.
Totem Lake is right up in here.
And if you were to go all the way down, notice that 124th isn't all the way down, and if it did, show them where Pino's Dairy would be. Way down over there. Okay, and the two railroads.
This is the one railroad that originally came in and went from Seattle, split at Woodinville, went down to Redmond, and then out to Squawk or Issaquah to the coal mines. That they would mine the coal, ship it back into Seattle for the ships. This was a later rail line that came from Black River and Renton through Kirkland on up to Woodinville and joined in, so the Northern Pacific could get to, through Sumas, get to the Canadian Railroad network.
What you have down at the bottom, where it looks like it might be a road, is the Sammamish Slough. In 1912, the farmers adjoining the valley decided that it flooded too long into the season in the spring, and they would pay themselves to have it dredged. They paid $60,000, and it went from Redmond to 145th, which is the street where San Michelle is on, and Red Hook Winery, that's the street. $60,000, and as you can tell from the 1936 photo, the Sammamish Slough still liked to meander down through some of its old thing. This distance was 12 miles. They reduced it to 6. And how curvy was this? Well, when the Woodins were there, they were the first family, white family, for a long time. And the McRedmonds came up to settle in Redmond. And they came up on a scow with all their belongings because there was no road between Kirkland and Redmond, so it was easier to go the river. Mrs. McRedmond was a recent widow who had 2 children, and it was very obvious that she was expecting with her new husband. And so the Woodins, being very generous neighbors, said, well, if you need any help when the time comes, come and get us. So the time was approaching, and Mrs. McRedmond said, don't worry, I have an Indian squad to take care of me as a midwife. I will be just fine. I've had 2 children. Mr. McRedmond would say, oh, no, this is my child. You need a white woman. So he got in his rowboat, rowed up that squiggly little slough all the way to the Woodins, which are closer to Bothell, and got the Woodins, rowed all the way back, and a day and a half later, he has a ride home to a healthy wife and a healthy daughter. This is a picture of the Wooden family. You have seated Ira and Susan. The children, Helen is on the left. She was 7 years old when they came. And Mary was on the right, and she was 4. Frank was born in Woodinville 7 years after they came. This is their second home. That first home was small, and they scavenged part of the parts to make it a home. And it was located, if you remember, where Chassis Cedar Company, Lumber Company was for years and years, right across the street on the slough. Their house, this house was used as a school, a church, and a post office. Susan Wooden was the postmistress, and she said it was the worst job in the whole world. And if you really hated someone, you would convince them to be postmaster. She said it was a lot easier to sell her butter than to be postmistress. Now, they had dairy cows they brought out from Seattle, and they let them graze on that sweet grass in the valley. And as such, her butter was very good, and people would pay for it. She would make the butter, she would take the rowboat, put the butter in it, and row into Seattle. Now this is without her husband, because her husband was a lot of time out logging. She would row into Seattle, down to the far side where Laurelhurst was. There was the cable car that came up, but she didn't want to pay 10 cents to ride into Seattle. So the cable car guys felt sorry for her, and he would carry her butter for free downtown to 3rd Avenue, where she would walk and then pick it up, hand deliver it to the homes at $2.50 a pound. And then she would walk back up the hill, get in her rowboat, and row all the way back to Woodinville. Now, there were days she did not make it. If the winds came up on the lake, she couldn't make it home in one day, and she would just go in along the coast and try to find shelter wherever she could. And this was easier than being postmistress.
Where did they get the mail?
Oh, the mail, yes. Mail came from Seattle by boat to Kirkland. And once a week, somebody would ride by horseback over the trails, and there were only the deer trails, to Woodinville and deposit the mail in her house.
Well, actually, they would go from there to and bring it back.
Right, right.
Somebody from Woodinville. And actually, Bothell got their mail at the Wooden home as well. So it was, in the early days, it was the focal point of the whole community.
The second set of settlers came 3 years later. We had Emmanuel Nielsen and Gustav Jacobson, who were brothers who immigrated from Norway. They each homesteaded 160 acres south of the Woodins. And shortly thereafter, Eric Jatterholm, you notice age 49, married Emmanuel Nielsen's daughter. He only had one child, Mary B., who was then 16 years old. They homesteaded another 160 acres adjacent to her father's and Woodin's, and this became the front street, the main old section of the village town of Woodinville. The Coffins came 3 years after that and homesteaded 160 acres where Movax is, and they're noted because they gave the land for the school. When Nielsen's came, it was fall and it was rainy, and so the first year they lived in a tree stump. And you notice how they're flared, so they would usually cut about 14 feet above. This is the Seattle Times artist drawing of their house they lived in. And if you have a little trouble visualizing this, the next slide shows you one in Arlington that actually existed. In this little stump, you have the mother, the father, 2 kids, and the little young one. 5 people living in there. Emmanuel and Greta Nielsen were part of the second set. They had Mary B. as their daughter. This is Emmanuel. He was a ship carpenter, and before he built his store here, he designed an ox-driven powered pile driver, which he designed in 1889, and with it, he built the Woodinville Bridge across the Saloon and the Stringtown Bridge closer to Bothell. Greta is his wife in the middle. She never learned to read or write English. And on the far left is Billy. This is Mary B.'s son by her husband. And when he died, she became a very wealthy widow, courted by men all over. And the new one she married wanted a family of his own. And so Billy went to live with his grandparents. And he stayed in Woodinville for a long time. The third set of pioneers that came were Arthur Llewellyn Caucus. See, we told you we had a picture of him, Russell. This is Russell's relative. And he gave land for the school. These are the early homesteaders who, by 1905, have proved up and received their patent claim for the land. The Woodins, first of all, let's show you where the railroads are, so you can get where you
Yeah,
are.
the railroads came from Seattle along Lake Washington, through Kenmore and Bothell, came to Woodinville, and split. One went north through Grace and on up to Sumas to connect to the Canadian Railroad station. The other one went south to Redmond and on out to Issaquah, the coal mines. The other railroad I talked about came in later and joined it here so they could get into the Canadian system. Woodinville itself developed right in this Y where the train split, and you'll hear why, because it's around the railroad depot. To orient you, this is the current old wooden school in Woodinville today, downtown. This is Mobax, would be located right about there. Hollywood School is right down here, and St. Michelle's Winery is right in there, and Red Hook is right there. The 160 acres Ira Wooden homesteaded are shown here by this L-shaped piece of property. The Jatter home, Mary B., that was her piece, and she platted the land for Woodinville itself. Emmanuel Nelson had his here, and Jacobson, the brother, had his 160 acres on the valley floor. This is a hillside up here. The valley was down here, but this all flooded in all the time. Andrew Anderson, that's Elmer Carlberg's relatives. And he had the house down here that you looked at that had the turret that's not there anymore.
And up on the far left where it says H.L. Guinea, that is part of the Guinea family. That's one of the 4 relations. Okay, I think we're ready for it. A Seattle investment group headed by Judge Thomas Burke and Daniel Gilman, as in the Burke-Gilman Trail, founded the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Railway out of frustration that the Northern Pacific Railway decided to terminate its line in Tacoma rather than Seattle. So, in 1887, it finally reached Woodinville, where the line split. One branch went north to Snohomish and then on to Sumas, and the other branch then went to Redmond and then to the coal mines in Squaw. And this split resulted in a triangle in Woodinville, which allowed whole trains to switch directions. It was the only one where you could do this from Seattle to the Canadian border, and it is still the only one that can do that, and that's the way the unit train turned around. The railway forever changed the valley. This Y was very, very important. because without it, the train would not have stopped. It would have been simply a flag stop, which would have disappeared with time, just like Derby, Willows, York, Grace. They're not there. Before the railroad came, there were no roads because there was no need for roads. They were all traveling by water. With the advent of the railroad, we now have a depot, we have people getting off, and we have a need for stores. So the Wood Sanders store was built, the Rainier Saloon immediately afterwards, the American House, and other businesses, bing, 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 right around the depot where the trains stop.
This is kind of a diagram to show you what we're talking about. This is where the original junction was located right here, but the depot was later built here on pilings. Next to it was the first store, Woodinville Sanders store, the Rainier Saloon located here. Then this was all floodland down here, so all these were built on stilts. This is uphill, and this is Front Street, and this is where the rest of the businesses developed. Tea Garden store, Nielsen store, American House, and the Parsons Hotel and Restaurant, Dodd Adjustable School Desk Factory, and blacksmith shop, John Cook's blacksmith shop. The Royale House was built over here. Orientation is, this is 175th Street here, the bridge going across, and here's the school. There's where the little white church would be at that time, the Methodist church you'll see later. And this is the cemetery, which is there today. And these are the sawmills. They're very important to Woodinville with all the lumber. This is the original Machias Mill, and then the Saginaw Mill came in later and took over both this whole piece of land right down there.
Okay, and number 26 at the top of the screen is Millview Dairy, which we'll talk about. Mary D., before she got married, and she platted the town of Woodinville, where all the stores are going to be built, and she filed it. She paid the filing fees, and it wasn't until over 100 years later that actually Woodinville became a city.
I have a question.
Yes.
So when they turn the trains around, they could just use the
Okay,
triangle?
Right. That wasn't there originally. It's interesting. This little piece of track was missing. Well, they had was this came in and joined it. And what they had actually was a turntable right here. So they could come in and turn the engine around right there.
Okay.
But later on, they added this section here. So now a train could come up, go out here, back up here, and go back down this way. So they could actually turn the whole train around versus just turning the engine around on a turntable.
Is there any signs left of the turntable?
It actually, I talked to the DeYoung's family that built the mill here, and he said when they built their store over here, it's there, it's under the blacktop. It was later filled, the cavity where the turntable was, from ashes from the train. And then they just filled it in and paved over it. So if we dug down there, we know it's there. I would love to be able to get that, to do that someday.
You can get to the ashes.
And the brick, because it's a fairly deep pit.
Yeah.
Because they have all the tracks down there to rotate the train. But nobody knew there was a turntable, and I couldn't find anybody, yet we had a railroad map that said there was a turntable. Finally, one of the DeYoungs, who was it?
Al?
Not Al, Lowell. DeYoung, and I talked to him about it, and he said yes, when he was a kid, and they first started out in the family, there was the turntable there, the remains of it. So we do have verification it was there, plus the railroad map.
This is a picture, and notice that it's not just called Woodinville, it's Woodinville Junction. We discovered the railroad is the one who named the town. And that's how it got its name. The Woods lived there. Yes. Notice the tracks, one on each side of the platform. This is our second permanent depot, which was built in 1893. They built one originally, a little farther east, and it was on pilings, and the slough kept flooding, so they built a second one using exactly the same plans, closer to Bothell on higher ground. This is a 1939 photo. You should note the ladder and the fire water buckets up on top. It was very common for these trains to put out sparks, and there was a regular fire bell, and it just meant that either the depot was on fire or somebody's house was on fire right next to it, and everybody would drop everything and run and put it out. And it was just an everyday occurrence. This is your first store, the Wooden Sander store. Woodens were the first people there. Mary Wooden married Thomas Sanders, and they operated it. This is a 1911 photo, and this building was built in 1888. And if you notice, it's on pilings. The slough is behind it. You will also note that it has wood planks. Those planks, wood planks, go directly to the depot. Now, because of the Y, and the trains had to switch one direction or the other, they stopped the trains. Every train stopped, no matter which way it was going, in Woodinville, and they filled it full of steam, they filled it full of fuel again, and everybody got off the train. They had to have somewhere to go. And they didn't want to get wet feet, because this is rainy, muddy place around here. So this was the first store. Oh, ingenious pioneers. Our first one. The second building was the Saloon. This was built in 1889. It's built on pilings also. It also has a wood plank that goes directly to the depot. It's owned by Seattle Brewing and Malt Company, which later became Rainier Brewery. On the downstairs side, you have Vic Anderson there. He's the bartender. He's also an entrepreneur, and he later built stables so you could rent horses, and then the carriages when we got the roads, and then cars. And he's standing in front of the door that goes into the saloon. The door on the right goes upstairs to a restaurant and hotel. And you notice it's called Junction Hotel because this is still called Woodinville Junction, not just Woodinville. Now, there was a restaurant up there because women at this time could not go into the saloons. They could not walk through the saloons and go up the stairs. They had to have a separate entrance to go upstairs. What's very interesting is on August 15th, 1912, the county commissioners did not renew their liquor license based on the strength of a citizen petition. This was 8 years before Prohibition. This was the last place in the valley that had not already closed.
So we were a dry valley after that.
American House was built on Mary B's property on Front Street there. First building on Front Street. It's called the American House. It was built in 1889 and operated as a grocery store. And the little door on the right takes you upstairs to the hotel. It burned down around 1900 and was later rebuilt as something else. But notice all the large timber. Remember when we saw the people living in the tree stump? That's the size of your virgin timber here. And look what's left. Look what they had done in the 20 years. There's nothing left. This is Front Street. Somewhere between 1912 and 1914, they had just gotten power and telephones. Now, doesn't go across the river necessarily or anywhere else. It just came from Bothell and it is on Main Street. Down on the right, we'll start with the Thatcher Railroad Depot. That is the Wooden Sanders store. And that's the Rainier Saloon.
Remember now, these are all below the railroad tracks in the flood zone, so all those three were built on pilings on that side.
On the left, just out of the picture, is John Cook's Blacksmith Shop. Next to it is the Dodd's Adjustable School Desk Factory, the Parsons Hotel, Emmanuel Nielsen's store, and a far end tea garden store. This is John Cook, and you notice he's got horses for hire. He's got cars for hire also. And down on the right, what you need to know, those are 1-inch metal water pipes. There are 3 springs up on the hill on Mary B's property here, and they are piping the water down to Front Street, and they are selling it. So this is our first water district. Note the horse there, because we will see him in the next couple pictures. There's a young delivery boy. The little sign on the back reads, Seeley and Pelton, Veterinary Surgeons. And we are inside John Cook's Blacksmith Shop. You can see on the far left the tail of his horse. There's the car he has for lease or rent. There's an old wagon wheel. He's got to shoe the horses. He's got to fix the wagons. He's got to fix the cars now. He has up above axe handles. We're still doing logging. And John Cook there is standing in front of his anvil. The anvil is his headstone in the cemetery. And then, this is Dodd's Adjustable School Desk Factory. It was built in 1907, and Mr. Dodd was a school teacher. And at this time, you know, you had to teach 1st through 8th grade, and he was having a little trouble with these 18-year-old 8th grade boys. So he decided he didn't want to be a teacher anymore, and then he was also very frustrated because the desk that fit the 6-year-old did not fit the 18-year-old. So he had a brilliant idea of how to solve this problem. Unfortunately, he wasn't very business savvy. So a couple years later, he has lost it in bankruptcy. And this has become then the Ruel Brothers store. And they put in big plate glass French windows in the front because we needed light because there's no electricity yet. And the upstairs was used for the community social events. And then for 2 years, it was used as a temporary school because our school had burned down. Next. There,
This is the desk that he invented that was adjustable. It's got a lot of cast iron, but there's bolts on each side and a track system so this desk could be raised up and down, and the seat could go up and down as well, so that it could be used by different sized pupils. This extension on the back of the chair was actually, this is Elmer Carlberg's chair and desk in the school. His dad put that on there to give him additional backrest on his chair. And that is now part of our collection for the museum.
And the little girl there is Gracie Steiger, who is a Wooden family descendant. This is the school desk factory after it became the Ruel Brothers, and they put in those plate glass windows for light. This is next building down. It's the Parsons Hotel and Restaurant. This is built prior to 1909, and later it became Glenn Denning's house. He was the station master, so he could just run across the take care of when the train came in. And they only came through in the morning and in the evening, so that's okay. Notice to the far right, you have Woodinville Mercantile Building for the first time. It expands later, the first piece. Next one down is Emmanuel Nielsen's store. He was Mary B's father, and he lived in the little house on the left. Now you notice there is a high porch to the store. This is so that it was the same level as wagons, so they were easily loaded. This is the interior of his store, and there's a poster in the middle, and we blew it up, and it's for the Bothell High School senior play, and it is dated 1916. So we know that's when the photo was taken. And what's interesting is there was electricity there, but he chose not to hook up. He's still using the kerosene lantern. And it may be that he's getting quite elderly now, and he's been a widow for a long time, and he just may not have wanted to change. This store carries everything. We have sausage in the back, so if you didn't want to go to the restaurant or to the saloon, you come and he slices it off and sells it to you by the slice.
You can look at it, you can see this one here has not been touched, but this one is flat on the end. He actually uses this to slice off pieces of it at a time, and then hangs it back up.
He is selling everything, from the cans in the back of milk and corn and ketchup and olives to canning jars, hurricane lanterns, sacks of sugar, flour, horse feeding bags, canvas tarps, blankets, anything you need. And in the glass case, the most valuable thing he has in his store, which is the cigars, the cigarettes, homestead tobacco. And he has searchlight matches in there. And did I miss anything?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Notice, there is no cash register. He uses the ledger in the back to keep track of accounts. Next one down is Carson Shop. It was built in 1890. Originally it was a mercantile store built by Milt Russell of Bothell. And in 1904, it was sold to Clara and Sarah Jacobson. The Jacobson family was part of the second group of settlers, and Clara and Sarah were both born in Woodinville. Clara went through Woodinville School, Bothell High School, went to the University of Washington, and got a bachelor's degree, and came back and taught in Woodinville School. Now, she was courted by Harry Teagarden for years and years. And finally, she said, yes, I'll marry you. So they married in 1914, and Sarah then moved off to Seattle, got married, and Clara and Harry ran the store. They called it Teagardens, but notice T-E-E and the T-E-A. The family story goes, Clara said, I'm the college graduate. T is spelled T-E-E. It is not spelled T-E-A. And Harry, who is a Quaker, said, but my family has been here for generations and we've always spelled it T-E-A. And Clara says, not anymore. Well, Harry died first, so on his gravestone it is spelled T-E-E. The Horseshoe Saloon sits in this location today. If you go, that's all that's on Front Street. Then you cross the bridge. This is the bridge built by Emmanuel Nielsen with his ox-driven pile driver. Notice that it's wood. Notice the walkway. Aha! Mr. Calkins over here, who had a lot of kids and also housed the teacher, got tired of having having to row the kids across this swampy land every day to school, so he donated his land, which means all the other kids are living on the other side of the slough and had to get to school. So they built the bridge. On your left, you have the Hargis boarding house. You have the barn way up there, and that is Mary B's land. And you have John Cook's blacksmith shop, the Dodds Adjustable Schoolhouse factory, and the Forester's Lodge. Now, most people in Woodinville were either loggers or they worked for the mills. And that was very dangerous work back then. And there was no life insurance, there was no health insurance. So the Forester's Lodge came into existence to help the families when they needed it. And eventually it petered out and was not needed. The bottom part was rented out to the Ruel brothers for the Woodinville Trading Company, which then moved up and became the Ruel brothers and the Dodd Adjustable Schoolhouse factory. Upstairs was used for community hall and for court. And when court let out for recess at lunch, they just ran down the back stairs and hopped right over into the saloon, because you gotta remember, women couldn't be on juries back then either. Okay, we'll cross the street then. Oops, are we not crossing the street? We're gonna stay on this side, sorry. There's the Hargis boarding house on the left. It was built in, where are we? I'm getting lost. Anyway, the Woodinville Tavern was built is shown here in 1956 photo. The boarding house there was built in 1910. It was remodeled in 1947, so it could become a modern hotel. And it housed primarily the railroad crew. And McCory's on the Slough replaced it. This is Machias Mill, which opened in 1903, named by Colonel Miller after his hometown. Jesse Brown bought the mill in 1911 and operated it until 1926. The Youngs bought it later and turned it into a shingle mill because the cedar stumps were now available sitting around, and they had logged almost everything else. Okay, and then Jesse Brown got bored with just taking care of the mill, so he built the Millview Dairy up where Dairy Queen sits. In the 1920s, he bought 100 acres from the Wooden family. And he had a farm that stretched from where McLendon Hardware is now to Home Depot in the valley over there in Bothell. 100 acres. It was a very modern facility. Each cow was washed and groomed before entering the milking room. They had their own trucks. They bottled the milk and delivered it to the homes directly in Seattle for 9 cents a quart. Jesse Brown's grandson, Bus Brown, who's still alive, bought the dairy business in 1949 and operated it for 10 years until State Highway 522 cut the farm in two, making it impossible to get the cows to the barn across. This is of the current view. You want to talk this one, Jim?
Well, this is just a picture of where the railroad train split in Woodinville, and we talked about the roundabout was buried back here. This is the DeYoung feed mill, which you probably all recognize. It did burn at one point and got rebuilt, but this was the very important center of Woodinville for a long time, because before the mill was there, this was a lettuce packing shed, and all the farmers in the valley were bringing their crops there. They would send 200 boxcars of lettuce a year to the East Coast from the packing shed that was located there. So the valley farming was very important until World War II, and after that it never did recover, and the Youngs then converted over and built the feed mill.
When you cross the bridge, you are then on 175th, which a lot of us like to call just Main Street now. You have the Woodinville Cemetery with 1 acre of land donated by the Woodens. You have the Little White Methodist Church and the Wooden School. We're all on the same side. This is 175th of Main Street. We're looking towards, Mobax would be way down there on your right.
It's looking east towards Duval.
And what you have on the left is the new cemetery and the Little White Church. Notice the road. Notice the wood sidewalk. The wood sidewalk was put in because they got tired of having to clean the mud off of all the kids' shoes on the school floor. The main road here turned left and went in front of the church and around to Grace and Snohomish. The road that is currently there to Mobax was still there, but there were just a few homes scattered in there. And that was all, that's the way it was. Okay. In this cemetery, you have a lot of our early pioneers. You have Ira and Susan Wooden, Emmanuel Nielsen and his wife for the second set, Gustav Jacobs and his brother and his family's there, Arthur Calkins, who donated the school land, is there, John Cook, the village blacksmith, and his animal are there, Clara Teagarden and Harry, the early school teacher and proprietor of Tea Garden Shops, and Elmer Carlwood, who for many years was a cemetery caretaker. This is a 1917 photo of the Little White Church, and it was built around 1905. They finally received electricity in 1929. The poles are there, the school had it, but the church just hadn't hooked up yet. This is a picture of the old pioneers. In 1957, a car came around the corner going too fast, ran into the church and knocked it off its foundation. They were building a new church they currently have on the other end of town, so it was not a total disaster. But at that time, in 1957, they still did not have indoor plumbing. They used an outhouse. Woodinville was a little slow in some things here. Here's the picture of the school. It was built in 1892 on the land. One school enrollment ranged from 30 to 49 students, one teacher. Had no indoor plumbing, well water supplied it out near the school, and later a hand pump was added. This is next one is the two-room school, built in 1905. In the background, they have moved the one-room school, and it became the teacherage, or teacher's residence. And this school had 72 students when it opened. 2 rooms, okay. 2 years later, they had a big fire in the stove in the middle, and then sparks went out the chimney and caught the roof on fire, and the whole school burned down. So they went over to the Dodds Adjustable School Desk Factory. And February 1910, they opened with the first brick schoolhouse east of Lake Washington. Now, they put a water fountain on the inside, but they neglected to put any restrooms. So there's no indoor plumbing as such. So they had to take this one-room schoolhouse away from the teacher and move it up to the side of the school and put a partition down the middle so it became boys and girls bathrooms. What?
Were they modern bathrooms?
Well, sort of for 1910, yeah.
Or was it wasn't?
No, it was not outhouses. So, and by 1913, first time they had 3 teachers in 3 rooms. This is the current wooden school. It was built in 1934. which is the fourth school on this site. It was built during the Depression under the WPA project. WPA said you could take the government funds for remodeling, but you could not use them to build a new building. Therefore, the back wall of this building is the original one. In 1948, it was expanded to add 4 more rooms, and so that it is what it is currently today. This is where, yeah. He's looking at me like, wait a minute. He has more. Yes. This is where our discussion of Woodinville ends, and this is the cover of what our new book will look like. It will be old pictures, which you have seen, and it will have what is there now.
So attempt to tell a then and now of what all along the business district, how it evolved with time. And we're slowly getting there. It's been a lot longer project than we anticipated.
Do you have any questions? Yes.
So when, you said the railroad, the name of the town of Woodinville, they named it after Woodinville, okay?
I think probably the Wooden family was there. Where are we going? Oh, we're going to the Woodens.
Well-
What's the main source?
And they did buy land from the Woodens for the tracks that came into town there, and that's where they located the depots on the Wooden land property.
And that may have been simply where it came from too. We don't know.
Yeah, there's no history. We just know the photographs and the railroad documentation. They call it first, very, very early in the drawing stages, like
It was just
West
junction.
Coast Junction.
West Coast Junction.
Then it became Junction and Woodinville Junction, and then it stuck Woodinville after that. But we see it in the early photographs of the depot and of the platform there. So we know that it was done in 1887, 1888. It was named that.
Do you have any houses still remaining?
The oldest house we have in Woodinville, being a very poor area, most of the homes weren't built of substantial grade. They all were torn down with time or burned down. A lot of them burned down. The oldest, we do have one. It was built in 1900, and it is currently the Hollywood Animal Hospital that is just south on the front street towards Redmond a little bit, up on the hillside. And it's the oldest building left in Woodinville.
The rest of them are about 19.
And it was Brown's residence, Jesse Brown, and the family lived there for years. It got restored a number of years ago, and it is in really fantastic shape. But if you go in it, and they let you, the windows are actually the original windows, and they're sagging. You see the glass, how it's been there for so long. But it's the only old building we really have left.
Other than school?
Other than the school, yes. The other oldest ones were out by Cottage Lake, a couple buildings.
About when the Hollywood School was built?
The Hollywood School was built in 1912 and paid for by Mr. Stimson. He moved out there and developed the Stimson property, and it was named Derby at the time. And they had a bunch of holly trees that she liked, and they renamed the area Hollywood for Holly Trees, not Hollywood, California.
When did the school close?
Which school?
The Hollywood School.
1921. They had, the enrollment kept dropping and dropping and dropping. And it was a very controversial time for the people that actually lived in that enrollment area, which was very small. And they couldn't decide, and they kept voting time after time after time. Should they pay more money and keep the school open? Because at that time, school teachers got whatever the district paid. Or should they join Redmond? Should they join Bothell? should they join Woodinville? And they voted to join Bothell simply because they were the cheapest.
If the building survived after 21,
Yes.
Yes.
They're still there
It's
today.
still there.
but it wasn't empty, I would imagine.
It was,
It stood empty for a long time. Mr. Stimson had died. Mr. Stimson had been ill for a long time, but he died without a will, which meant it took a long time to settle the estates and things. And so it sat vacant for years. And it was bought then by the Grange, the Sammamish Grange, which had been in existence and now currently owns the land on the other side. And then when they built the other building, it became an auction house, and other little stores and everything before the college spot. Is that correct, Phyllis?
Right.
She worked on getting that, it's national heritage or state heritage,
It's city and state.
city and state.
And St. Michelle, the house in St. Michelle is county, state, national, and city. And that was Fred Stinson's house.
His summer cottage, they referred to it as his summer cottage.
The Stimson house was built in 21, was it?
No, it was built, started about 1910, 1911, and went, 1915, 1916 is when he started getting sick. But by that time, he had chicken farms up on the hill, he had all the dairy barns, he had everything else going, and the greenhouses were, Mrs. Stimson, her hobby grew roses, and they shipped them to South America and the floral trade in Seattle. Not just her hobby, Lynette.
Was that the Stimson family in Seattle?
Yes.
That was his brother.
That's
brother.
his brother.
right.
Right.
That was Charles.
They are now available through the Museum of History and Industry at the library. You call them up, you give them specifically what you want. And they will record as best they can. They're on the slides. They will get out for you and then you order what you want. It's very Jim, do you remember how much it cost for the photos that we got from the?
No, it's pretty nominal.
It was nominal.
It wasn't very that expensive.
And some of, you noticed the one that came from UW, that was like $20.
Yeah, the UW is very expensive to get their photos. And then for us using a book, we have to negotiate with them how much we pay per book to use that photo. We haven't got through that yet.
That's in the U.S. collection?
Yes. You have a question?
Yes, I have a question. Because of a woman I befriended in Juanita when I used to draw for the election in the late 60s and 70s, and she was a descendant of either the Hollywood, either the Stimson family or the Marimore family, because after she lived up on, she told me a lot about this part of Juanita, the Shingle, because her father used to rent spaces to men who worked in the Shingle on the corner of 93rd and Northeast 124th. And that Shingle Mill, the Shingle Pond, Shingle Pond is versus the country.
Too much noise here, right?